Tom Brokaw is the chief anchor for NBC's Nightly News and the author of a bestseller called The Greatest Generation, and joins us tonight from the CBS studios back in New York. Thomas, thank you for coming on. Welcome back to CBS, and thanks for staying up late tonight.
As you know, I'd do almost anything for you.
I know you would. Tell the as you know story. I tried to find the videotape, but I couldn't, but it was very, very funny when you did this to me.
Well, when we were colleagues in Los Angeles and didn't always see eye to eye on what constituted the news of the day, I would often be out covering the political stories, and I took them more seriously than I suppose I should have. And when I would come on and stand beside you, and I could see the kind of glazing over in your eyes, you would introduce the latest budget story from Sacramento. So I'd always begin it by saying, Tom, as you know, this is the most important story in California today. And then we would go on from there.
Right. And then you made a little videotape for me when I left KNBC to go to New York and Channel 4 there, and you parodied yourself. Do you recall that?
I do. I remember that very well. I remember vividly. I think that probably people don't realize what happens when we have these kinds of shared experiences. They often wonder what kind of relationships that we have, and that you and I were there during the halcyon days of KNBC, and it was a glorious time for the growth of California, but it certainly was a glorious time for two young men, one from Milwaukee, one from South Dakota, who wanted nothing more than to be in this business.
Right, but as you said that night in my farewell, you said, you know, I would always come on and say, Tom, as you know, and then you added, the fact of the matter is,
he didn't.
He didn't know.
And didn't care.
And you were right then, too. I saw you on MSNBC yesterday, and you posed some rhetorical questions that may be occurring to many American people. Where is Kosovo? Who are the Serbs? Why are we there? Do you think that the American people will galvanize some support behind this military action, which goes under the name of NATO, but is basically and primarily an American enterprise?
Well, I think in the first 3 or 4 days, Tom, that the American people always rally behind American troops, even when they don't know where they're going or exactly why, because they understand that American young men and women are in harm's way. But this country always makes tough judgments about big military and political decisions, and they're going to be talking about it at the office water cooler at home, and they're going to be doing some more serious reading about it now. And if something begins to go wrong, they'll begin to ask tougher questions. I think that this is the most perilous military enterprise that we've been involved in since the Gulf War, and in some ways more dangerous than it was then, because at that time, as you'll recall, the lead up to the Gulf War took several months actually to get the whole alliance in order to get the country behind what was going on. We were only dealing with a single enemy, Saddam Hussein. We knew exactly where his forces were.
And at the time, George Bush made certain he got the cooperation and support of a lot of nations around the world to form a coalition.
And he brought along the American public. He educated them before they pulled the trigger. You know, I remember going out there in August of one year, and it was not until March that the trigger was really pulled. This time we've rushed in there, even though it's been percolating for some time now, and I think the country is saying to itself, okay, we'll back them in the short term, but we want to know long term, what are the prospects for us there? And that's the hard question to answer. There are going to be, what I don't think the American public fully understands yet, if this works out exactly as we'd like it to, that means that American troops go into Kosovo. That means they go in as peacekeepers, but that's still a dangerous situation.
You know, the question I hear at our water cooler here is, there have been generations of conflict in that part of the world. Can we now resolve that generations of conflict? That's the question I hear now.
Well, the short answer is no, we can't.
No.
What we're trying to do is buy some time and trying to direct our force and political energies toward one man, Slobodan Milosevic, hoping that we can get him to back off from the atrocities, objectively speaking, they were being committed. There was a form of genocide being committed almost every day in Kosovo. On the other hand, the ethnic Albanians who were living in this region that has been controlled, as you accurately pointed out, by Serbia for hundreds of years, and it also contains some of their most important religious monuments. The ethnic Albanians haven't been playing by the rules as well. So there's not many people to cheer for here.
As I go through The Greatest Generation, story after story, the thing that touches me, and you've mentioned this in newspaper articles talking about your experiences, is the humility of these people. They really don't think that what they did was such a big deal, but rather it was a duty that was not forced upon them, but which they accepted gratefully almost, the saving of the world.
I think that there were 3 reasons for that, Tom. I think part of what happened with that generation is that their most formative years, when they were teenagers, Their expectations were formed by the Depression, when everything that they got, they earned, and there was a kind of humility forced on this land just by the economic deprivation. And then they went off to really save the world. I just ask our audiences today to think about what would it be like now for us if Hitler had prevailed or if Tokyo had prevailed. And they saw so many horrors and went through so many sacrifices during World War II. And when they came home, they knew that they'd all been through it together. So they said, there's no sense in me trying to pat myself on the back because the guy or the woman on either side of me did just as much. Just let me get on with my life.
And the respect that they get now has been a long time coming. There is no World War II memorial anywhere in this land.
No, one of the things we're trying to do is get it built. Bob Dole is leading the effort, and Fred Smith from Federal Express. They want to raise a couple $100 million by next year. Again, it's a reflection of that generation that they don't want any help from the government. A number of senators have said, listen, we'll just appropriate the money. Bob Dole said, no, we're going to do this on our own. There ought to be a single place in this country where you can go and reflect on that experience.
Exactly.
The most emotional experiences that you can have if you go to Europe, for example, are to go to the beaches at Normandy or to go to any of the American cemeteries. So I hope that we can get that done. But most of all, what has been most gratifying to me is that this book has generated a lot of dialogue within families, within communities, within friendly circles. And I think that the stories are now beginning to be told, and that's been an unexpected dividend for me.
And I mean this, I don't know how old you are, and I don't know how much of the war you remember as a boy growing up in South Dakota, but if you do have those memories, how did it touch your life as a kid?
Well, I'm just a beat or two younger than you are, not much. I was 3 years old in 1943, and that's my first real conscious memory kind of life. And we were living on an army base at the time. And the war was all around me. You know, everything was camouflage green out there in the sagebrush prairie, and they were setting off explosions as they were testing ammunition. And
I think we have young Tom Brokaw standing in front of his house on the screen right now. Yep.
I believed I wore that helmet almost every day, and I believe that I did. And I remember being in the ditch fighting imaginary Germans and Japanese because I thought my whole life would be enveloped by war. I didn't know any other kind of world at the time. And then suddenly that war came to an end, and then there was another kind of era in America. It was the era of real working class prosperity, especially in the place where I came from, which had been hit so hard by the drought and the Great Depression, and people just put the war behind them and bought their first new cars and had their first really good-paying jobs, and we kind of forgot about the war. Well, all around us, the men who had fought the war were our high school coaches and businessmen on Main Street, or the women who were teaching Sunday school, or the mothers of my friends were Army nurses and Red Cross workers. And then suddenly, in 1984, I went off to Normandy to do a documentary, and it came flooding back to me again.
I can remember my mother and father with the radio at night listening to accounts from the war and being cheered by Allied victories and being disheartened by Nazi victories or by Japanese victories in some parts of the Pacific. Same at your house?
Yes, and also what was also true is that people forget how primitive communications were at that time. Meredith's father was gone for 5 years, and she remembers vividly in her grandparents' house that everything came to a halt at 10 o'clock at night when the radio newscast would come on because they didn't know where Merritt was. They knew what division he was in, and they would hope to hear some word of what was happening with that division, but no one would say a word. And, you know, sweethearts and wives and mothers of sons wouldn't get letters for months at a time. And then suddenly, in too many tragic cases, there would be a knock at the door and an Army officer would say, we're sorry, you've lost your son in the Pacific or in Europe somewhere, and there would be another star on the window. I
remember the stars in the windows when I walked to school in the morning and home at night. And it seemed every couple of days there was one more star along the way. And I remember rationing. I remember my mother with the coupons for sugar and for meat, and my father the coupons for gasoline, you know. And the war touched everybody. We all had something in common back then as Americans, and that was winning the war.
Yes, and Bob Dole has talked about this. Here was a man who was in combat, and he said to me, Tom, I just hope that you write about the farmers who stayed home, and sometimes they were not as honored as they ought to have been by other people because they were not serving in the war. but they were raising food for the troops overseas, and that's why they got the deferment they did. And people who couldn't go into combat went to work in the factories.
That's right.
And women learned to do things that they had never done before.
Oh, look at Rosie the Riveter here in Burbank at Lockheed, for heaven's sake, building planes to fight the war, to support the war. It touched the lives of everybody, and we all had some. I remember as kids, we would buy 10-cent savings stamps to go towards the purchase of a savings bond, at the time called war bonds, to help, you know, finance the war.
And every family saved rubber bands, and every family didn't throw away things because it was going to be used for the war effort.
Aluminum foil from rolling up balls of aluminum foil to be used to, you know, support the war. We're chatting here with Tom Brokaw from NBC News, the author of The Greatest Generation. Back with Thomas, you on the toll-free right after this from our sponsors and the CBS television stations all across America. With Tom Brokaw at CBS Television in New York, here's Todd on the toll-free in Cincinnati. Hi, Todd, and welcome to CBS Late Night. Hello.
Good evening.
Good evening, sir.
I had a question for Mr. Brokaw.
Sure.
He seems to be always to me, to be the consummate professional. I wonder if there was ever a story he had to cover that was emotional or troubling for him.
Oh, I think that there have been a number of them over the years, and it's generally, it surprises people. It's the smaller story, and I bet Tom agrees with me about this. You'll be cruising along in a broadcast, and then suddenly there will be a grieving mother talking about the loss of a child, or there will be a particularly poignant story of some kind, and it catches you unawares, and you can barely recover. I've never broken down on the air, but certainly I've had my difficult moments. The single toughest day I ever had, I suppose, was when the Challenger blew up. I had covered the space shuttle a long time, and in fact, one of the astronauts on board, Judy Resnick, had been my first kind of expert commentator, and we'd become friends over the years, and we used to have these kind of silly bets about the NASA timetable, and I, in fact, had just had to pay off a six-pack to her about a month before she went on in that ill-fated flight. And so that day was a long and difficult day, because every time I'd look at that curl of smoke in the skies over Florida, I would think about the horror that they had to be all going through.
Considering what you've had to report the last year and a half out of Washington, do fellows and women who do what you do for a living ever say to yourself, how the hell can this be going on?
Oh, sure.
I mean, how can this be happening?
I remember a year ago, Tom, that I had gone down to Mexico to interview the president, and then had flown from there over to Cuba, where I was going to be covering the Pope, who would be visiting Fidel Castro. And I thought, boy, this is still a good life. Here I am in Mexico interviewing the president, little charter plane into Havana, you know, have a cigar and maybe a little late night rum, and spend the next 4 days going from mass to mass across the island of Cuba.
And watching the Pope be the Pope.
And the next morning I got up and my computer was aflame, and there were phone messages for me, and it was about the president and an intern and suborning perjury and committing perjury and obstruction of justice, and Vernon Jordan was involved. And I thought, man, have I arrived in an alien culture of some kind. Maybe I'm not just in Cuba, maybe I've been catapulted into outer space. And I knew then that this is going to be a very long year, but it got to be a long and very sordid year, I think, for the entire country. So I was very empathetic with the audience, who kept saying, I've had enough of this. But at the same time, we had to see the process through.
Todd, I'm glad you called, and thank you for watching us tonight, sir.
Thank you, and best luck with your future endeavors.
All right, thanks a million, Todd. I appreciate that, and thanks again for watching us tonight. Let me ask you here about this this fellow who was your governor when you were a kid, Joe Foss, and who was also a soldier, a warrior in World War II.
Joe Foss was truly larger than life. He'd been on the cover of Life magazine during World War II. He was the first man to equal Eddie Rickenbacker's record of shooting down 26 enemy aircraft. He was a little bit older. He was a 27-year-old Marine pilot out on Guadalcanal. He was in the skies every day, and in the first 34 days that he was in the air, I think I've got the numbers right, he shot down the 26 planes.
Man.
He was flying, in those days, what was called an F-4F. It was a Corsair. It was not as quick as the Japanese Zero, so you had to be tougher, and you had to fly right at them and hope that they would break off, and they almost always did. Then he came home and he became the governor of South Dakota, and when I was 17 years old, I was elected governor of something called Boy State,
which is a
student political program, and Joe and I hit it off, And midway through that summer, I was working in the bottom of a rock quarry in northern Iowa, dying and praying for deliverance. And I get a call from the governor's office saying, I've been invited to go to New York to be on a quiz
Hallelujah.
show, and I want you to be my partner. And I thought, prayers have been answered.
Yeah, there you are as a young kid on the show with the governor, and then I'm told that when it was time to go home, you didn't want to go back to Dakota.
No, I saw the bright lights,
Yep.
you know, of Manhattan, you know, the lure of that. And I said to Joe, God, I've only been here for 24 hours. I haven't seen very much. And he looked at me for a moment. He said, well, I think you ought to stay a few more days and see some things. I've got to go back. You call your parents, and I'll see them on Monday, and we'll work this out. So I went back to the hotel room and called my dad, and I said, Joe Foss thinks that I ought to stay here a couple of more days.
Yeah, take a look around.
And take a look at the city and see some things. And there's this long pause, and I could almost see his furrowed brow. He was conferring with my mother, and he came back on the phone, and he said, you know, you'll probably never get a chance to see New York again. So we think that's not a bad idea. Stay a couple of days. And I did everything. Big Dodger fan, went out to Ebbets Field, went to the top of the Empire State Building, you know, out to see the Statue of Liberty, saw a Broadway show, hung out late at night, had a great time.
And I didn't know, except from your book, that Julia Child went to war.
She did.
The
Almost
French chef,
everyone did in those days. She wanted to be in one of the military branches of service, but she's too tall. As you know, she's a very large woman. So as she said in that distinctive voice of hers.
And by the way, I do know that because I've worked with her.
Yes.
You just said, as you know, and that I do know.
Well, she went into the...
Don't start up with this as you know stuff now.
She went into the OSS, and she went out into Southeast Asia, and she worked in intelligence, and that's where she met her husband. And then he was later in the what became the CIA after the war, and they were in Europe, and that's where she developed her...
OSS, Office of Strategic Services.
Yes, indeed.
All right. And did you ever ask her what would have happened to her if she hadn't gone to war?
I did, and she said, well, I would have probably become an alcoholic in Pasadena.
Oh, dear, I've cut my finger.
Right.
We're chatting here with Tom Brokaw of NBC's Nightly News. Back with Tom for a few more minutes, and you on the toll-free as time permits after this short timeout. You know, I heard you mention back there that you were elected a boy state governor of Dakota when you were a lad.
Right.
And I've read from time to time that you may place your name before the electorate again.
No, that's not true.
Okay. I just thought I'd throw it out there.
Yeah, no, people have suggested that from time to time. It's very flattering. I still have this great passion about politics. I think it's an extraordinarily important part of our lives. But I'm like you. I want more of a private life, not more of a public life at this stage of my life. And I hope that we'll get very good people into the arena. But I'm not going to be one of them.
Okay, Mary in Delaware Water Gap, Pennsylvania. Hello.
Hi, Tom.
Hello, Mary. How you been? Okay.
Fantastic, thank
That's
you.
good. That's good. What's on your mind tonight, love?
I'd like to ask Mr. Brokaw, did his dad ever share his wartime experiences with him, and is that where he first became intrigued by that generation?
Well, we had an unusual experience. My father was a little bit older, so we moved to this Army base, and he got drafted. He went off to answer the draft, and the Army base, the commander there, called him back because he was so important in keeping that place running in the middle of the South Dakota winters. So we had him at home during the war, which was unusual. But all of the people around us, obviously, had been in the war. And what has been really striking to me since I've written the book is the people that I've heard from that I didn't realize had been at the war. My first baseball coach, for example, the best guy I ever had coaching me in baseball, wrote to me the other day, and he'd flown more than 30 missions as a member of the 8th Air Force. He was a turret gunner. I didn't know that. And I think that what I've tried to do is encourage a lot of people is to go out and ask folks in their neighborhood or in their community or in their family in their 70s and 80s now what they did do during the war, and then encourage them to tell the stories, because it's a part of history that we shouldn't lose.
No, and it's a generation that's leaving day by day. More leave.
Yeah,
Mary?
they hate it when they hate it when I say it. They're dying at the rate of 1,000 a day. There are just a little more than 3 million left now. And they're a hardy group, but in fact, they are in the mortality zone, so we need to hear these stories.
Yeah, you can kid Mother Nature, but you can't fool Father Time, huh?
Right.
As you know. Mary,
Mary,
I'm glad you called, and thanks for joining us tonight.
Tom, thank you for many, many years of sincerity and class.
Okay, Mary, listen, kid, you may not see me, but I'll be right around the corner, okay?
Thank you, Tom.
All
Good
right,
night.
Mary, all right. Can you believe it's almost 30 years since we worked at KNBC in Los Angeles?
No, I can't.
My God, Brokaw, 30 years.
Yeah, we had a great time.
Yeah, we did. And by the way, we killed Channel 2 so dead they still haven't come back out here.
No.
And I work for CBS now.
We were just talking about that here. I think that that was a kind of a wonderfully serendipitous coming together of a lot of young, ambitious talent, and those were newsworthy times in California in the 60s and 70s, obviously.
Geez, remember the night Nixon landed out in the parking lot and came into the studio next door and said he was going to China?
Right.
Yeah.
I remember that vividly. There was stuff going on all around us all the time, and we were just happy to report to work every day and happy to have a dry place to do just that. And when we were making the kinds of salaries that now they hire local anchormen for in the 45th market in the country, we were still very pleased with all of that.
I remember the big earthquake, remember, out in the parking lot? And
yes,
Nixon
David,
coming in, as I said, and the Manson trial was going on when I first got out here. A fellow named Stan Atkinson was down every night, remember, at the courthouse covering the Charlie Manson trial.
That's right.
And you always had a thing for politics. I remember you'd always be reporting on Reagan, on the governor, on the presidential races. You loved it back then.
I did, and you know, it served me very well because California was the wellspring from which so many of our national politicians have come since then. You know, I got to know Nixon in those days, and obviously when Reagan got to be President of the United States, he remembered that I'd covered all of his governor's campaigns, and the people that came through California having to win that state would have to pass through one of the programs that you or I would be doing, so they would recall that as well. It still does define who we are. I think that's not as important in our lives as it has been in the past, but we'll always be remembered by the kind of political leaders that we elected at any given time, so we do have to think carefully about these people who do represent us.
And then when you left L.A., as I recall, did you go on to the White House?
I did. I became I was the White House Watergate correspondent. As I sit here in CBS in New York, I remember vividly that I was called to Washington because there was a giant killer at the White House for CBS by the name of Dan Rather.
Right,
and I was going to be this kind of Pygmalion character throwing myself at him day after day after day. He had a big head of steam. He is to this day a very tough competitor. But we came to regard each other, I think, very well. Our wives are very friendly. We've known each other a long time, and we both count those days, Dan and I do, as among the most memorable in our careers.
How has it all changed for you, Thomas? What's changed in our business? You know, I've been away from news for a long time. In fact, in many ways, I was never really in it, but as you know. but yeah, I was. But how has it changed?
Well, let me just say at the outset that you were in it and you were better at it than you ever wanted to acknowledge publicly. And you know, you could have done anything that you wanted to in it. You also love the other side of it as well, obviously, of this business. It's changed now, Tom, because it's so much more crowded and the pressures are so unrelenting. And there's no time for reflection. There's no time for organization. It's get it on the air, move on, hit again. And it's really created a kind of form of drive-by journalism in America. I think that the evening news broadcast at NBC, CBS, and ABC still stay within the mainstream, but this extraordinarily crowded cable universe.
MSNBC, CNN, Fox News
Fox,
Channel.
all of them. And then you have more news on the internet now, you have more news on radio, you have more news on local television, and that creates a huge appetite, and you've got to fill it with something. And what it gets filled with does not always pass the test of what we used to describe as news or as credible news. That's the biggest single change, that plus the technology.
As a viewer, what I notice is the sound bites are so short now. I remember when we used to run sound bites, they'd run a minute and 30. That day is long gone, I'm sure.
Yeah, but I think that's also a reflection of the rest of society. I mean, music is shorter, cars move faster, the film clips are shorter when you go to the theatrical films these days. You know, we just want to speed everything up. And I don't think it's just because you and I have entered into what I call geezerdom. I think that,
well, speak for yourself, Charlie.
I think it is because the nature of speed. Look, the new technology, computer technology, it's all about speed. Bill Gates has just written this book about do your office business at the speed of thought, and that's what the digital process is all about.
How often do you get back to Yankton?
Well, I'm going back actually in about 6 weeks. I go back about once a year, if not always to Yankton. I always get back to South Dakota. I try to go back and do one of the rituals of growing up there, which is pheasant hunting in the fall. You know, when I left there, I was very eager to see bright lights, big cities, far horizons.
Sure.
But after a few years, I was very eager to go back and feel the soil and look at the broad horizons
and drive down Tom Brokaw Boulevard.
And I can go down Tom Brokaw Boulevard now. One of my favorite friends in Yankton, Ashley, has a bail bonds business, which he immediately changed the address to Tom Brokaw Boulevard.
As you know, I think the world of you, and I thank you for your friendship, and I thank you for coming on tonight, sir.
Tom, I wouldn't have missed it, and I wish you all the best. I know that our paths will cross in many, many ways in the years to come. It's really been a pleasure to be here tonight.
Good night, young man.
Okay.
Okay. Tom Brokaw, anchor of the NBC Nightly News, author of The Greatest Generation. Next, a look back on some of the stuff we've done here over the past 4 years and some months, but now, this for our sponsors and the CBS stations.